There have been very terrifying inroads into the development of nuclear delivery systems that start blurring that differential between nuclear deterrence, where basically no one fights because we know it's mutual suicide, into where it's the possibility that under certain circumstances, a nuclear power may decide that there is an advantage to using limited nuclear strike against some form of an enemy.
Welcome to the latest episode of the CEA Institute's Expert Series. In this installment, we spoke with Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary, Professor Rob Huebert. Huebert discusses the many changes to Arctic security structures and institutions that have occurred as a result of the war in Ukraine, how the war has shifted Canada's focus in the region, the extent to which Russia poses a threat to the Canadian Arctic, the various infrastructure that must be prioritized in the region to enhance its security, as well as how the war has impacted Russia's relationship with China. What changes have there been to the overall security structures, infrastructure, and institutions in the Arctic as a result of the war in Ukraine?
I think that there has been two major changes. The first change is one of perceptions. Once again, we have to remind ourselves that the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2014, not 2022. But there was a very clear effort, to a very large degree led by the Canadian government, to basically pretend as if that wasn't an invasion. Even the terminology, illegal occupation, suggests something less than war. And of course, we accepted the Russian narrative that it was not them that had invaded in the eastern Ukraine, but were merely little green men, or whatever other derogatory term that we use to basically avoid calling the Russians out for militarily invading its neighbor and seizing its sovereign territory. And so I think that what's happened in 2022 is that there has been the realization that such narratives can no longer support what the Russians are doing. Because, I mean, when we consider that the Russians have been using military force to respond to challenges on their borders since Putin since he becomes acting president in '99, with first of all the Chechens, and in 2008 with the Georgians, and of course the war starting in 2014. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as a result of that realization, you do see a reevaluation in terms of the governance systems that are in place in the Arctic. Some people will make reference to the fact that this seems to have ended what was referred to as Arctic exceptionalism, the idea that somehow the Arctic was in a zone of exceptional peace and cooperation, where geopolitics somehow seemed to be avoided. And so we see the Arctic Council being put on pause, serious reconsiderations to what that means going into the future, whether or not we'll see it as an Arctic 7 rather than an Arctic 8, whether or not they will wait for this particular phase of the war to die down and then try to reinvite the Russians to come. All of this, of course, is being debated at this point in time, but at the heart of it, it's the infrastructure. I think the third thing, I should add a third thing that is of perhaps even the greatest importance, is the realization that for the last 20 years, the Russians have been redeveloping their nuclear capabilities. We see countries such as Kazakhstan and Ukraine that actually eliminated their nuclear weapons. And so that once again, we have to understand the intent that the Russians had as they modernized their nuclear capabilities, but even more problematic, the development of clearly of new delivery systems that are obviously intended to defeat the American anti-ballistic missile system, that basically starts pushing these delivery systems more towards tactical nuclear weapons rather than strategic nuclear weapons. And what that means is that if you have an emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons in their delivery systems, you're thinking in the context of how you're actually going to be utilizing this. What it ultimately means is that it has become clear to everybody that the Arctic is a major theater of operations, of geopolitics, and undermined by the existence of this nuclear threat.
To what extent have Canada's objectives in the region been undermined as a result of the war in Ukraine? Has the war forced Canada to rethink its approach to or its understanding of Arctic security?
Well, it should forced Canada to rethink its approach to Arctic security. We have made all sorts of words with all sorts of governments, not just this one, but even the preceding one, to modernize NORAD. Remember, NORAD has not really been modernized in terms of its radar system since 1985. There's been some upkeeps, so it would be unfair to say that we've done absolutely nothing from 1985, but the major infrastructure has not been updated. We haven't even begun to think about what it means in terms of the underwater dimension of any form of surveillance system. And so we, at a minimum, see the rhetoric of the government changing. We see the rhetoric of the government now saying that it does have to do more NORAD. We see a greater acceptance of the role that NATO is increasingly playing in regards to the protection of the northern region. And we see the government at least changing its rhetoric from one that ultimately it has to be able to embrace and accept Russia as it did from when it got elected to up until February 2022. Remember, the Harper government brought in a relatively mild set of sanctions against the Russians when they invaded in 2014. Most of which the Liberals, when they came to power, either ignored or outright challenged. And so that has changed. And so we see a greater acceptance of the ability to actually cast blame on the Russians for their aggressive actions. Having said all that, I say rhetoric because there remains issues in terms of exactly what we are actually going to be doing. We had the June public announcement in which the Minister of Defense stated that there was going to be $4.2 billion in spending on NORAD. Now, there was a little bit of confusion at that press conference whether or not that represented new money or was money that was, of course, from the budget that had been released earlier. These were questions, of course, put forward by Mercedes Stephenson and Murray Brewster at the press conference. And anyone watching it will recall that both her and General Ayres were not able to answer the question whether or not it was new money or simply the new money from the budget. Now, what it transpires is that apparently, and one always has to be cautious because of the difficulty of getting information out of the government, is that the $4.2 billion actually represents a component of the $8.1 billion that was promised in the budget over 6 years. And so once again, you start doing the math, you say, okay, so that's 4.2 out of the 8.1. There was monies that was also allocated for amortization of other projects, and that's over 6 years. And that means for everything else that they need to do above and beyond what they're doing, i.e. the new money requirements. And once again, it's difficult to be precise, but it suggests very strongly that we're really talking about maybe $1 billion in new money per year. And anyone who operates in the North, the moment you're talking about all of the promises that were made, the over-the-horizon, two lines of over-the-horizon radars, the new development of a weapons system, and a couple of the other promises that were made at the June meeting, and it's just impossible. You're not going to be able to pay roughly $1 billion a year and come anywhere near. And of course, as I said earlier, it doesn't address the issue of not touching underwater threats that the attacks on the pipeline off the coast of Denmark clearly indicate that we have to be thinking about too. So rhetoric has changed. The position of the government seems to have changed, but we're still waiting to see whether or not it actually translates into any action. I would dare say the fact that the government, of course, refused to provide any meaningful energy supplies to the Germans in specific, but all of the Europeans in terms of trying to remedy some of the impacts that have occurred because of the sanction regime, also illustrates that it is more stronger on the rhetoric than it is on the delivery. To turn around and say to the Germans, wait for about 5 years and we'll get you all the hydrogen that you want, when of course the Germans are facing real energy shortfalls this winter, and the British you can add into as well. I think just shows that we are quite strong on the statements. I question in terms of the intent, in terms of the ability.
To what extent does Russia present a real threat to the Canadian Arctic? How can we respond to that threat, or rather, what will it take for us to do so?
I think the view that the Russians don't pose a threat I would characterize it as a danger of what I would call the Ardennes syndrome. You recall in 1940 that the British and French came to the conclusion that the Germans would not utilize any type of an attack, let alone a mobile armor attack through the Ardennes forest, because in their view, it was too difficult. And so if it was too difficult for the French and the British forces to do it, the logic was that the Germans wouldn't do it. And I dare say that I see a little bit of that in terms of those that say that the Russians do not pose a threat to Canada. The argumentation, when you deconstruct it, of those who say there's no threat will say it's very difficult for operating in the Arctic. We haven't seen any signs of the Russians necessarily coming into that region. The conclusion is therefore drawn that the Russians would not come because if it's difficult for us, it's going to be difficult for them. And you see the similarity, of course, of that thinking and what that means if we were to say from a historical analog, if in fact we think that, well, that was how we were thinking in terms, or at least the British and the French thinking in 1940. And we know, of course, nobody informed the Germans. And I fear that, of course, that when we start using such logic against the Russians, the same problem will arise, and that no one tells the Russians that, no, it's too difficult to do so. Now, where the problem comes in, is, of course, is the higher level of the nuclear threat. If we were dealing with a strictly conventionally powered Russia, then, of course, the real threat is to the immediate Arctic region, Finland, Sweden, the Balkans, and so forth. But the problem is we're dealing with a nuclear-armed Russia that has invested heavily on tactical nuclear weapon systems. So you start talking about the two classifications of the stealth, both the cruise missile variant and the glide missile variant. You're talking about the Poseidon underwater autonomous vehicle, which may or may not be a torpedo. We're still trying to figure out how that is classified. We're talking about the ability of the MiG-31s being forward stationed in the various bases that the Russians have created. And you sit there and say, okay, well, they obviously have this capability that is forward deployed in the Arctic region. So if the Russians keep the battle strictly conventional to Russia, to Ukraine, you say, okay, I get it. You know, it's not going to be directly affecting Canada. But then you start saying, okay, well, but we see that the Russians do not follow what we say is the logical thing to do. When you look at their way of war in Georgia and Chechnya, they don't fight wars like we do. They fight it dirty. They fight it as a grinding match. They don't do the shock and awe that we do and that we expect. And so the question is, well, if it gets escalated as Putin keeps threatening to do so, is it simply going to follow in the context that we think? And we think that, well, if they use nuclear weapons or dirty weapons, it'll be a demonstration event in Ukraine. But what happens if they make the calculation that they need to go beyond that, that they need to at least knock the wind out of the Americans? And the way that you would do it is you take out their listening capabilities, their forward bases. So that means having a tactical strike against the Nordic countries with their bases. But it also suggests that Anchorage and Thule become a possibility. Now, is that a very high probability? Not at all. But once again, if we can see the logic in that to make that strike against Ukraine and the resupply, and you want to silence and at least push the Americans back on their heels for that short little period of time, unfortunately, there's a logic to that. And that means Canada is right in the line of fire if they were to do that. Now, once again, I want to stress, you know, incredibly low probability, but we're in war. And so, once again, that's where we place. Now, the problem comes in. If you are going to actually deter the Russians from doing so, you have to take the threat very serious. So here's the paradox. It may be that it's too difficult for the Russians, but the only way that we can truly protect against that is to ensure that the Russians look at the entire North America as a nut too hard to crack. As long as the Russians are saying, you know what, that may make logical sense, but you know, it's too seamless. There's no weak points. So therefore, let's not do it. So even if the Russians are not going to do it, even if these others who say that there's limited threat, the only way that we can ensure that it is no threat is to basically, you know, improve our protective capabilities and assume they are a threat. By assuming that they are a threat, we have the paradoxical effect, and it's all related to nuclear deterrence, of decreasing the threat. If they are a threat, if they are thinking that logic, well, then we need to defend it against it. Either way, that points to a Canada that has to get much more serious in doing what it says it's going to be doing.
What kinds of infrastructure needs to be prioritized the most in the Arctic? What are the potential obstacles or challenges to ensuring we address security gaps in the region?
Well, we have to make sure that the infrastructure allows us to actually defend against the Russians. Once again, as General Van Herk, the head of NORAD and Northcom, has repeatedly said, you need an extended integrated deterrence, and that means that you got to show the Russians that if push comes to shove, if we find ourselves in an actual shooting match, we will prevail. And so what that means on the Canadian side is there can't be weak points within the northern continent. And that means that we have to ensure that our various listening capabilities, our surveillance capabilities, the forward operating radars that have been promised in the June announcement are actually put into place. We also have to get serious about putting in some type of underwater capability of determination. Is it a full-fledged SOSUS? Once again, that's going to depend on the technical evaluations that go in terms of the threat, but some form so that the Russians know that there is a seamless ability of the North American countries to detect what is coming. Once again, getting back to Van Herk's concept of forward deterrence, we also have to make sure that we have the ability to respond. So if a MiG-31 is sighted, we need to be able to have airfields with the support and infrastructure so that we can respond. That means not only having the airfields 24/7 having a capability, it means being fully integrated into the American system, both at the level of NORAD, but also in terms of operational capabilities. And we also have to have something that's there to be able to defend. And that means right now, of course, it means our F-18s. But as you know very well, the F-18s were purchased in 1982, with the exception of the Australians that we bought, which were a little bit younger aircraft. 1989, I think, is where most of them were built. 88. Nevertheless, those are aging aircraft, and so we run into the situation, well, we need a modern fighter, and that seems to be the F-31. But see, once again, we go back to the budget numbers that were released, and we start saying, well, something's not adding up here, but nevertheless. So we need the fighter capabilities. We also need the refueling capabilities, because if we're forward on these bases, if we're responding to the Russian aerospace threat, we then have to refuel these aircraft. We have to refuel any fighter capability. So it's not just simply singling out and suggesting that the F-31s, Super Hornets, the Swedish, all of these would require refueling capabilities for the loitering that will be required to respond to that type of threat. And so, those are the type of things that immediately come to mind in terms of what we're doing. What's the challenge? I think the biggest challenge is that, as we can see from the lack of actual commitments of money and of actions, and the constant refrain of political senior leaders to constantly come back to the suggestion that there is a limited threat. At least we're not saying no threat anymore, but there's a limited threat. And then immediately turning to issues of the very critically important issues of human security within the Canadian Arctic. I think that we don't have the political elites having the proper attention on this issue. There's no, they'll offer and saying, look, the security of Northerners, in particular in Northern Indigenous peoples, have to be forefront. They're absolutely right. I mean, the suicide rates, the economics that these people face is atrocious. It doesn't take away, unfortunately, from the fact that the Russians still provide a real and present threat. And so what this government has to do is figure out how it has to address the domestic security issues that it absolutely has to address, but it also has to figure out how to do the external threat. And then it has to figure out how to do it in a time where, of course, we've heard the government saying that the economics that we are now facing are so problematic that everything's going to be cut back. So there's a clear indication that not everything matches at this point in time.
How has the war in Ukraine impacted Russia's relationship with China, and in what ways might China benefit from Russia's current position? General Wayne Ear recently said that Russia could essentially become a vassal state of China. I'm wondering what you make of this assessment.
Well, I mean, other people have made the analogy that what we're seeing right now is sort of a repetition of 1938-39. Italy had been the sort of leading aggressive fascist state of Europe. We saw that with its efforts in Northern Africa. And most people saw Mussolini as sort of the senior spokesperson of the authoritative states. And of course, we know by 38, maybe even as early as 37, the German state exceeds, but everyone still kind of remember Chamberlain and Delors go to Mussolini for the Czechoslovakian crisis with the belief that somehow Mussolini can contain Hitler, which, at that point wasn't going to happen. I think we're seeing a similar process. I mean, Ayers calls it vacillation of Russia. But I mean, remember, Russia's got a GDP that's over the period that we're talking about, 1999, when Putin seizes power onward, their GDP is probably less than Canada's on a per annual basis. And yet, look at the military capabilities that they built up. That's an extreme effort to achieve that. Having said it, it's still at the level of Canada, and you compare it then to the GDP of China, and you look at the defense budget of China, and of course, China is significantly more powerful than Russia. Our focus is on Russia, but China, and anyone who's been observing will tell you, they've got a bigger Navy than the Americans. Not more powerful, but bigger in terms of numbers. Air Force numbers are also probably catching up to the Americans. And so we sit there and say, okay, well, China is the more powerful state, but it has not been as overtly aggressive in terms of its international relations. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that they still talk about remedying the century of humiliation, which is to redraw the boundaries that they saw that were unfairly imposed upon them, including, of course, Taiwan into that calculation. Having said all that, we now have the situation that I think the Chinese realize that they have a great opportunity to, of course, to consolidate and ensure that they are creating a new rule-based system that is going to be centered around them. To do so, relying on Russia as a junior partner makes eminent sense in this context. Now, we may hear Xi making certain critiques against Putin on certain stages, as we have in the very last recent time. But obviously, the Chinese statement that the Arctic Council can't go ahead without Russia is a clear effort to try to paralyze the Arctic Council, because the Chinese know that the Russians aren't going to want to go back to the Arctic Council, and that the Western states have all sort of basically made it clear that Russia has to pull out of Ukraine before it's going to be allowed to re-engage. Of course, it's not kicked out at this point. We have to be very clear on that. And that's not going to happen. So when the Chinese do the disservice, like, oh, Russia has to go back, what it's actually done is it's frozen it from that context. Now, whether or not everybody pays attention to what China says on that issue is, of course, another issue. But nevertheless, I think it's very much in China's interest to tie the Russians to them as close as possible. It allows them to challenge the Western-based international system. It adds overall to the difficulties of West responding to, say, a Chinese intervention against Taiwan, if in fact Russia is keeping the attention with its threat of nuclear weapons as it's in Ukraine. And so you put all those pieces together from a geopolitical perspective, call it vassal, call it Mussolini to Hitler, call it whatever terminology you wish to use. Russia serves Chinese interests very well. Russia is militarily inferior to China, but both Russia and China face the common opposition of the West. You put that calculation together and you can see what the medium and even the long-term future holds for us. The Arctic is where it is important from the geopolitical position because of geography and weapon technology. It's where the Russians put their most dangerous weapons that are going to escalate the crisis. That's why the Arctic is central to all of this. I want to make it clear. We're not fighting over the Arctic, but we're fighting because of the geography of Russia and the American requirement to then respond to the Russian threat. The issue in Canada that we have not addressed yet is this changing weapon technology. I fear that what has happened is that since about 2007, 2006, when the Russians made a determined effort to respond to the American advancements in anti-ballistic missile systems and thinking, is that we entered into a new era of nuclear weapon competition. And this is something I don't think that has really come to the forefront of our thinking. I don't think that nuclear deterrence has come to an end. I think that still is the major backbone of how we stop having a nuclear war. But I think there have been very terrifying inroads into the development of nuclear delivery systems that start blurring that differential between nuclear deterrence, where basically no one fights because we know it's mutual suicide, into where it's the possibility that under certain circumstances, a nuclear power may decide that there is an advantage to using limited nuclear strike against some form of an enemy. Now, it could be the Ukrainians, it could be someone else. And I think that in Canada, we have not yet come to terms. I mean, when you think of the difficulty we had in responding to the pandemic, the organization, getting ourselves into the mindset, and even the opposition that is drawn to something as what most people would think common sense about getting vaccines and all that have never been a problem. And then we try to think, okay, well, what does this mean, though, in responding to a nuclear threat? We can see that we have not yet arrived there in terms of how our thinking is proceeding.